Imagine uncovering a truth so devastating that it shatters the very foundation of your existence. For James Holloway, a dedicated Texas sheriff, what started as a simple DNA test led to the horrifying discovery. 3 children he had loved, raised and protected as his own. 3 little faces he had tucked into bed each night, believing they carried his blood. But when the results came back, they revealed an unimaginable betrayal. None of them were his, and the true father, his own brother. In an instant, James's life, his marriage, his family, his very sense of identity, collapsed beneath him. The betrayal ran deeper than anything he had ever faced, deeper than anything the law had ever prepared him for. And before the truth could fully settle, the rage took over. What happened next would leave an entire town in shock, a family in ruins, and 2 people dead. This is the story of how one devastating secret led to a crime that no one saw coming. Welcome to Shocking True Crime Stories, where the most chilling real-life crimes come to light. Every case we cover is based on true events, some terrifying, some unbelievable, but all shocking. If you have a passion for uncovering the darkest mysteries of the criminal world, you're in the right place. Subscribe now and let's dive into the depths of true crime together. James Holloway was the kind of man people trusted without question. A dedicated sheriff in a small Texas town, he had spent years serving his community, enforcing the law with fairness and integrity. He wasn't just respected, he was admired. Neighbors saw him as a man of principle, a protector, someone who could always be counted on in times of trouble. But beyond the uniform, James was a devoted family man. He and his wife, Melissa, had been inseparable since their teenage years, high school sweethearts who had built a life together from the ground up. Their marriage was the kind of love story people envied, steady, enduring, and filled with the small, everyday moments that make a family feel unbreakable. Together, they had 3 children. Emily, age 10, with her father's sharp eyes and quiet determination. Jacob, age 8, always brimming with energy and curiosity, and little Lily, age 6, the baby of the family, who still climbed into her father's lap at the end of a long day. James lived for them. His family was his foundation, his greatest achievement. Every decision he made, every shift he worked, every late night at the office was for them. And then there was David. James's younger brother had always been a fixture in their lives. The 2 had grown up side by side, sharing bunk beds as children, getting into harmless trouble as teenagers, and later standing beside each other at James's wedding. David had never been far away. He was the kind of man people were drawn to, charming, outgoing, the life of the party. David was carefree, the one who could light up a room with a single joke. His easygoing nature made him a favourite among friends and family alike. He was Uncle David to the Holloway kids, always there for birthdays, holidays, and weekend barbecues. He was part of the fabric of their lives, woven in so tightly that no one ever questioned his presence. Family vacations, David was there. Sunday dinners, he had a seat at the table. When James worked long hours, David would stop by to keep Melissa and the kids company. It was normal. It was natural. Or at least, that's what James had always believed. To the outside world, the Holloways were the picture of stability, an American family rooted in faith, loyalty, and love. James, the upstanding sheriff. Melissa, the devoted mother, 3 beautiful children, and an extended family that was close-knit and supportive. No one, not a single person, had any reason to suspect that beneath the surface there was something much deeper, something hidden in plain sight. James never questioned the closeness between his wife and his brother. Why would he? He had never been given a reason to. In his mind, there was no cause for doubt. no cracks in the foundation of his life. But foundations don't just crumble overnight. They weaken slowly, piece by piece, unnoticed until the moment they collapse entirely. And James was about to discover that the life he had built, the marriage he trusted, the brother he loved, the children he would give his life for, wasn't what he thought it was. It was something else entirely, something that would destroy everything. What began as an ordinary day, a simple decision made on a whim, would unravel a truth so devastating that it would set off a chain of events no one could stop, not even James himself. James had never been the kind of man to question his place in the world. He knew who he was, where he came from, and the values that had shaped him. He prided himself on his roots, his family's long-standing history in Texas, their traditions, the strong ties that bound them together. So when he first heard about at-home DNA tests, it wasn't because he suspected anything was wrong. It was simple curiosity. Everyone was doing it, sending in a small saliva sample, waiting a few weeks, and then receiving a detailed breakdown of their ancestry. It seemed harmless, a fun way to learn more about the past, to confirm family stories passed down through generations. James had always believed he was a mix of Irish and German heritage. At least, that's what his father had always said. But was that actually true? He figured it was worth finding out. Maybe he'd even have a few surprises in his results, something he could share with his kids. He didn't hesitate when he ordered the test. He certainly didn't hesitate when he mailed it back. In fact, after a few days, he barely thought about it at all. Until the email arrived. The subject line was simple. Your DNA results are ready. James clicked on it without a second thought, expecting to scroll through a list of percentages, maybe some interesting historical tidbits about where his ancestors came from. But as his eyes moved down the screen, something immediately felt off. He frowned. The percentages didn't match what he had expected. The test showed connections to genetic groups that didn't align with what he had always believed. That was strange, but not impossible. Sometimes family stories weren't entirely accurate. But then he saw something else. A section labelled Close Family Matches displayed the expected names, his parents, a few cousins. But as he continued reading, his stomach tightened. His children weren't listed the way they should have been. They were there, but instead of the unmistakable genetic markers that would confirm his biological connection to them, there were inconsistencies, numbers that didn't add up, a gap where there should have been certainty. James sat up straighter, his heart starting to pound. He reread the results, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Maybe it was a glitch, a clerical error, some kind of mistake in the system, because the alternative was impossible. His mind raced as he logged into the website's help section, searching for explanations. Maybe he had entered something incorrectly. Maybe the company had mixed up his sample with someone else's. But deep down, a nagging thought took root. What if it wasn't a mistake? What if this was real? James tried to shake the feeling, but once doubt crept in, it was impossible to ignore. The only way to be sure was to conduct a more thorough test, something more precise, something that would either confirm his fears or put them to rest for good. So he did what any rational man would do. He ordered paternity tests for each of his children. He told himself it was just to eliminate the possibility of an error, that it was ridiculous to even entertain the idea. But as the days passed and the results loomed over him, a quiet dread settled in his chest. What if? What if? What if? The envelope arrived on a Tuesday. James stared at it for what felt like an eternity before opening it, his fingers trembling slightly as he unfolded the paper inside. The first name, Emily. Not a match. James blinked, reading it again. His mind refused to process the words. Not a match. He turned to the next page. Jacob. Not a match. His breathing grew shallow, his pulse roaring in his ears as he flipped to the last page. Lily. Not a match. James felt the air leave his lungs. His vision blurred at the edges as he reread the results over and over, waiting for the words to change. But they didn't. His children, the ones he had raised, held, comforted and protected, were not biologically his. The room around him seemed to shrink. His hands trembled as he gripped the papers, as if holding them tightly enough would somehow change the truth. He felt sick. His mind screamed at him to stop, to reject it, to convince himself there was another explanation. But then he saw the final analysis. The results hadn't just confirmed that he wasn't the father. They had identified someone else, a close match, a direct biological connection to the children. Someone within his own family, his fingers clenched around the pages as his eyes locked onto the name that appeared in the results. David, his brother. James sat frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe, unable to think beyond the crushing realization that his life had just been split into two, before this moment and after. Because now, everything was different, and nothing would ever be the same again. James Holloway had always been a man of control. His entire life was built on discipline, order, and a deep-rooted sense of justice. As a sheriff, he was known for his composure. Even in the most intense situations, he remained steady, never letting emotions dictate his actions. But this was something else entirely. The truth had hit him like a sledgehammer, shattering everything he thought he knew. His children, his babies, the ones he had held in his arms as they took their first breaths, weren't his. The woman he had loved for over a decade, the one he had trusted with his heart, his home, his life, had betrayed him in the most unimaginable way. And David, his own brother. James had read the results so many times that the numbers were burned into his memory. There was no denying it, no rationalizing it, no possibility of error. The children were David's. The realization clawed at him day and night. Sleep became impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, his mind played a cruel montage of memories. His wedding day, Melissa smiling at him as they exchanged vows, David standing right beside him as his best man, his children laughing in the backyard, David tossing them into the air as they shrieked with joy, the family vacations, the holidays, the nights he had come home late from work, only to find David there, sitting at his kitchen table. Had it been happening then? Had every moment of his life been a lie? Rage burned through him, hot and unrelenting. He wanted answers. He wanted to confront them, to demand the truth, to make them feel even a fraction of the devastation that was now his constant companion. But the words never came. Instead, the weight of the betrayal settled deep in his chest, heavy and suffocating. It robbed him of his appetite, his ability to focus, his will to move forward. He withdrew from everything, his work, his friends, even his children. How could he look at them the same way? How could he pretend that nothing had changed when, in reality, everything had? At the station, his colleagues noticed the shift almost immediately, and James had always been a rock, dependable, methodical, the kind of sheriff who never let personal matters interfere with his job. But now, his presence felt different. His responses were slower, his movements weighed down by something unseen. Reports that once took him minutes to complete sat untouched on his desk. The energy he once brought to the job, the sharp instincts, the unwavering focus, had dulled into something unfamiliar. "Everything okay, Holloway?" his deputy asked one afternoon, watching as James stared blankly at a case file. James blinked, barely registering the question. Yeah, just tired. It was a lie, of course. But what else could he say? That his entire world had collapsed beneath him? That he didn't know who he was anymore? That every time he heard his brother's name or caught a glimpse of his wife's face, something inside him twisted into something unrecognizable? The community began to notice too. The once friendly sheriff, who had always made time for a quick conversation at the grocery store or a reassuring word at town meetings, had grown distant. The warm nods and easy smiles were gone. When people greeted him, he barely acknowledged them. Rumours started to spread. Something's wrong with Holloway. Looks like he hasn't slept in days. I saw him sitting in his car for almost an hour yesterday, just staring at nothing. The weight of it all was unbearable. It wasn't just the betrayal, it was the realization that his entire life had been stolen from him. The marriage he had believed in, the children he had loved unconditionally, the very foundation of his existence. It was all a carefully constructed lie. And the worst part, everyone else had moved forward as if nothing had changed. Melissa still cooked dinner. The kids still ran through the house, their laughter ringing through the halls. David still showed up, still flashed that same easygoing smile, still acted as if he hadn't ripped James's world apart. It was as if they expected him to just accept it, as if they thought he would simply live with it. But James couldn't. He wouldn't. And deep down, in the quiet moments when the rage took hold, when the walls of his home felt like they were closing in on him, a new thought began to form, one that wouldn't go away. This couldn't go unanswered. Something had to be done. James had spent days, weeks, walking around in a daze and carrying the unbearable weight of the truth on his shoulders. Every moment was consumed by it. The betrayal, the deception, the sheer audacity of it all. He had tried to keep it bottled up, to push it down, to go about his life as if nothing had changed. But it had changed. Everything had changed. He couldn't sit across the dinner table from Melissa without feeling sick. He couldn't look at his children without the gnawing reminder that they weren't his. And every time he saw David, his brother, acting as if nothing had happened, his blood boiled. It had to come out. James wasn't sure how long he had been pacing the house, clenching and unclenching his fists, his mind spiralling with every painful thought. He didn't remember making the decision to confront her. It was like his body moved on its own, driven by something primal, something beyond logic. When he found Melissa in the kitchen, she was standing at the sink, rinsing off a plate. James's voice came out colder than he intended. "Tell me the truth." Melissa froze. For a split second, she didn't move, her back still to him, the water still running, and then, slowly, she turned around. Her face paled. She knew exactly what he was asking. "James." Her voice was barely a whisper, but he cut her off before she could continue. "Number no more lies." His hands were shaking now, his breathing uneven. "How long?" Melissa's lips parted, as if searching for the right words, but James had no patience for hesitation. "How?" Long dot. Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Then, finally, she exhaled, her shoulders slumping. "Years." The word hit James like a hammer to the chest. Years. Not a mistake, not a one-time lapse in judgment, not a moment of weakness. Years. James stumbled back a step, his stomach twisting. He felt like he might throw up. His entire marriage, his entire life, had been a lie for years. Melissa took a hesitant step forward, her voice trembling now. "James, I never wanted to hurt you." He laughed bitterly, the sound foreign even to his own ears. "You never wanted to hurt me." His eyes burned as he stared at her. "You had 3 kids with my brother, and you never wanted to hurt me." Melissa winced. I know how terrible it sounds. You know? James's voice rose, the fury bubbling over. You knew what you were doing, Melissa. Every single day, every single lie. You looked me in the eye. You slept next to me. You let me raise kids that weren't even mine, and you knew. Tears welled up in her eyes, but James didn't care. Not anymore. I love them, James, she pleaded, her voice cracking. You love them too. You're their father in every way that matters. His jaw clenched so tightly it ached. He wanted to scream. He wanted to throw something. He wanted this to be a nightmare he could wake up from. You don't get to say that, he said through gritted teeth. You don't get to stand there and tell me that I'm their father after what you've done. Melissa's breath hitched, and for the first time she seemed to realize just how broken he was. I never meant for it to happen this way, she whispered. David and I, it just happened. James's hands curled into fists at his sides. It just happened. As if years of betrayal and deceit could be brushed off as something accidental, as if a marriage and 3 children could be dismissed with a simple excuse. His voice dropped to something dangerously quiet. So, when did it start? Melissa hesitated again, and James saw the flicker of guilt cross her face. Tell me. His tone was sharp enough to cut. She swallowed hard. Before Jacob was born. James's world tilted. Before Jacob was born. Jacob was 8 years old. That meant this had been going on for nearly a decade. James stumbled back another step, his breathing ragged. His hands were shaking so violently that he had to clench them into fists just to keep himself steady. A decade. Melissa reached for him, her eyes desperate now. James, please, He jerked away before she could touch him. The thought of her hands on him now made his skin crawl. I can't do this, he muttered, shaking his head. His pulse was hammering, his vision tunneling. I can't. He turned on his heel and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him so hard that the walls trembled. He didn't know where he was going. He didn't care. All he knew was that he had to get out. Because if he stayed, if he had to look at her for one more second, if he had to stand in the house where his life had been ripped apart, he wasn't sure what he might do. He had spent hours driving aimlessly, his grip white-knuckled on the steering wheel, his mind a whirlwind of rage and disbelief. The words Melissa had spoken played over and over in his head like a broken record. Years. Before Jacob was born. I love them, James. The betrayal cut deeper each time he replayed it. It wasn't just an affair. It was his brother. It was his children. It was his entire world, built on lies, shattered in an instant. The pain was unbearable. He had dedicated his life to justice, to upholding the law, to protecting those who had been wronged, but now he was the one drowning in injustice. He had been the faithful husband, the loving father, the devoted brother. And what had that gotten him? A decade of deception. Somewhere along his aimless drive, he made a decision. He wasn't going to sit with this. He wasn't going to be the man who swallowed his pain and let the people who destroyed his life carry on as if nothing had happened. He wasn't going to let them get away with it. Before he even fully realized where he was heading, James found himself pulling into David's driveway. The house was dark, save for a dim glow in the living room window. He sat in his car for a long time, staring at the front door, his breathing heavy, his pulse thundering in his ears. He hadn't planned this. But there were no plans anymore. His world had been ripped apart, and now there was only this moment. James stepped out of the car, each footfall on the pavement feeling heavier than the last. His heart pounded, his hands trembled, but his mind was clear with a singular, all-consuming thought. David had to face him. He knocked, hard. A few seconds passed before the porch light flicked on, and then the door creaked open. There he was, David Holloway, his younger brother, the man he had protected, the man he had trusted, the man who had stolen everything from him. James barely registered the expression on David's face. Surprise, confusion, maybe even guilt. It didn't matter. "James!" David's voice was cautious, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What are you doing here?" James didn't answer right away. He just stared, his jaw clenched so tightly it hurt. "You lied to me." His voice was hoarse, raw. David blinked, hesitating. "What are you talking about?" James stepped closer. "You know what I'm talking about." David sighed, running a hand over his face. "Look, man, don't." The word came out sharp, like a blade slicing through the air. David glanced around, as if checking to see if anyone else was watching. "Let's not do this here." James let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, now you care about where things happen. Now you care about keeping secrets?" David exhaled sharply. "Listen, I never meant for it to—" James's fist collided with his brother's jaw before he could finish the sentence. David stumbled back, clutching his face. "What the hell, man?" But James wasn't finished. The years of betrayal, the lies, the stolen moments, everything boiled over in that instant. He grabbed David by the collar, shoving him against the wall, his breath ragged. "You destroyed my life!" he growled through clenched teeth. David struggled against his grip. "James, listen to me." "I trusted you." James's voice was trembling now, but not with fear, with fury. "I loved you like a brother, and you—" His voice cracked. "You took everything from me." The door behind them creaked. James barely registered Melissa's voice before he saw her standing there. Her eyes widened in horror as she took in the scene. "James, stop!" She moved toward him, reaching for his arm, but the sight of her, her face, the same face he had once adored, sent a fresh wave of fury crashing over him. She had chosen David. She had lied to him. She had watched him raise children that weren't his and never said a word. He let go of David and turned toward her, his breath ragged, his vision blurring at the edges. "How could you?" Tears streamed down Melissa's face. "James, please." But there was no plea that could undo what she had done. His heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst. His hands trembled as his vision tunneled. He didn't even realize what he was doing until it was too late. The gun was in his hand. He didn't remember reaching for it. He didn't remember drawing it from his holster. But now it was there. David's eyes widened in shock, hands raised. "James, don't!" Melissa gasped, stepping backward, shaking her head in disbelief. "James, please!" But there was no reasoning with the storm raging inside him. In a single, deafening instant, the night was shattered by the sound of gunfire, then another. And then— silence. James stood there, his hands trembling, his breath uneven. David was gone. Melissa was gone. And just like that, everything was over. The weight of what he had done crashed over him like a tidal wave. His chest heaved as he stared at the motionless bodies before him. The rage that had fueled him moments ago drained away, leaving behind something else, something hollow. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. A porch light flickered on across the street. Reality was creeping back in. James Holloway, the respected sheriff, the devoted father, the man who had spent his life enforcing the law, had just crossed a line he could never return from. The town of Willow Creek had always been the kind of place where crime was a rarity, a quiet Texas community where neighbours looked out for each other, where doors were left unlocked at night, and where the local sheriff was more of a friend than an authority figure. But in the wake of that fateful night, everything changed. News of the double homicide spread like wildfire. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the once peaceful town was in turmoil as Sheriff James Holloway, the very man who had sworn to uphold the law, was now in handcuffs. The flashing red and blue lights painted eerie shadows across the Holloway residence as officers swarmed the scene. A place that had once been a home was now a crime scene, cordoned off with yellow tape. Investigators moved in and out, their voices low, their faces grim. James sat in the back of a patrol car, his hands cuffed tightly behind his back, his head resting against the cool glass of the window. His mind was blank. Everything had unravelled so quickly. The drive to the station was silent. No one spoke. What was there to say? The officers escorting him had worked alongside him for years. They had shared coffee on late-night shifts, celebrated birthdays together, confided in each other about the struggles of the job. Now, they couldn't even look him in the eye. As James stepped into the police station, his own police station, whispers followed him like a shadow. Officers who once respected him now stood frozen, their faces a mix of shock, pity and disbelief. By the time the news hit the media, the town of Willow Creek was no longer just a quiet Texas town. It was now the epicenter of a national scandal. Residents of Willow Creek were blindsided. Some refused to believe it. Others whispered about the rumors that had circulated over the years. Small things, strange tensions between the Holloway brothers that no one had thought much of at the time. The biggest question on everyone's mind was, how could this have happened? James had been a devoted father, a loving husband, a respected officer. But in one night, all of that was gone. The town's sense of security had been shattered. If James Holloway, the man they had trusted, the man they had looked up to, was capable of this, then what else was lurking beneath the surface of their small-town lives? Amidst the media frenzy and the shockwaves rippling through the town, 3 young lives were left in limbo. Emily, Jacob, Lily. They had lost everything in one night. Their father was in jail, facing murder charges. Their mother was gone. Their uncle, the man they had trusted like a second father, was gone too. They were too young to fully comprehend the weight of what had happened, but they knew enough. They knew their world would never be the same. The children were taken into protective custody as legal proceedings began. The Holloway name, once synonymous with respect, was now the centre of controversy. Family members came forward, some offering to take them in, others arguing over what was best for them. A custody battle loomed, each side claiming they had the children's best interests at heart. But what was truly best for them? How do you rebuild a life when the foundation it was built on has been destroyed? James, sitting in a cold jail cell, knew one thing with absolute certainty. No matter what happened to him now, his children would carry the weight of his actions for the rest of their lives, and there was nothing he could do to change that. The investigation unveiled the complexities of the Holloway family dynamics. Evidence of the affair between Melissa and David surfaced, including correspondence that highlighted the depth of their relationship. Public opinion was divided. The case sparked debates about betrayal, mental anguish, and the limits of human endurance. Inside the courtroom, tension was thick. Rows of spectators filled the seats, family members, reporters, even complete strangers who had followed the case through the media. Every face told a different story. Some watched in sympathy, others in morbid curiosity, but all of them wanted answers. James Holloway sat at the defence table, his face unreadable. Gone was the uniform, the badge, the air of authority he once carried. Now, he was just another defendant in an orange jumpsuit, shackled by the very justice system he had sworn to uphold. The prosecution wasted no time painting their version of events. This was not an act of passion. This was a calculated, deliberate execution. They displayed crime scene photos, images too gruesome for the evening news, but all too real for the jurors who sat in silence, forced to examine the aftermath of that violent night. Melissa's body, found near the doorway. David, lifeless in the living room. Blood pooling beneath them. This was not a moment of blind rage, the prosecutor argued. This was a man who made a choice, a man who left his home, who armed himself, who knew what he was going to do before he ever knocked on that door. The courtroom was silent as the words sank in, but the defence had their own narrative to tell. They called psychologists to the stand, experts who detailed the mental collapse of a man whose entire world had been turned upside down. James Holloway was not in his right mind when he pulled that trigger, his lawyer insisted. This was a man who had just learned that his entire life had been a lie, that the children he had raised as his own, his pride and joy, were not biologically his, that his own brother, his own blood, had betrayed him in the most unforgivable way. They called James's colleagues to the stand, officers who had worked alongside him for years, who had seen the change in him after the revelation. He wasn't the same, one deputy testified. He wasn't eating, wasn't sleeping. He was like a ghost walking through the station. I knew something was wrong, but I never imagined. The deputy's voice broke. I never imagined this. Friends took the stand, describing James as a devoted father, a loving husband, someone who had spent his life enforcing the law, not breaking it. But the prosecution fought back. If this was truly a crime of passion, why did he bring a gun? They challenged. Why did he drive to his brother's house? Why did he confront them instead of walking away? The jury listened intently, each argument weighing heavily in their minds. This wasn't just a story about a man who had killed. It was a story about betrayal, about loss, about the irreparable damage caused by secrets. And now it was up to the jury to decide. Was James Holloway a grieving husband who had lost control in a moment of unimaginable pain? Or was he a murderer who had planned his vengeance the moment he learned the truth? The courtroom sat in silence, the world watching as the trial neared its end. After deliberations, the jury found James guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The verdict elicited mixed reactions. Some viewed it as justice served, while others saw it as the culmination of a tragic series of events that destroyed multiple lives. The case left lingering questions. Could the tragedy have been averted with open communication? What drives individuals to commit such profound betrayals? And how does one reconcile the duality of a person who upholds the law, yet succumbs to violent impulses? These questions continue to haunt those connected to the Holloway family and serve as a somber reflection on the fragility of trust and the human psyche. What are your thoughts on this case? Do you believe James's actions were a result of temporary insanity, or was it a calculated response to betrayal? Share your opinions in the comments below, and if this story intrigued you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more in-depth true crime documentaries. Thanks for watching.